Hello again, everyone. Welcome to the Adult Sunday School lesson for November 19th, 2023. I have another New Testament lesson, this from the book of 1 Thessalonians. We are in the midst of a unit that's entitled For All the Saints, in which we are remembering the saints of the church and the saints living among us through some of Paul's letters. We have looked at saints who have worked faithfully. We've looked at saints who give us hope. And today our lesson is entitled Saints Who Keep Awake. These are not questions about who's doing these things, but rather they're statements about the faithful among us who are being role models for us in terms of faithfulness, hope, and vigilance. Next week, we will shift over to the book of Ephesians, which will complete the unit. These lessons have provided us with instructions for living faithfully for a lifetime. These give us long-term perspectives when facing difficulties, and they are, in fact, our role models of faith that we see in the New Testament, and we see these same behaviors reflected by those saints who are living among us today. We are looking at the writings of Paul, who is a man of action. He was also a scholar and a man of writing. We're very grateful for his writings. And in fact, what we're looking at today is the first New Testament book written. I've mentioned in these weeks that Paul has got various detractors, those people who like what he says. Some people don't like what he says. So there are diverse opinions about Paul's writings. And we can look at Paul as the ultra-Pharisee when he was named Saul. He was persecuting the Christians. No one thinks that was the right Christian thing to do. But now in the book of 1 Thessalonians and 2 Thessalonians and Galatians and Corinthians and Romans, these are what's called the radical Paul or the first Paul or the authentic books. Later books of Paul that take a slightly different theological point of departure. We'll look at Ephesians in next week and see that it's a bit different. The theology expressed there is not typical of what Paul says in his early writings. And then when we get to the pastoral epistles, you'll see that there's a slightly different point of departure there as well, and that there are various levels or hierarchy within the church, and Paul gives instructions for different people based upon their status. Slaves are to do one thing, faithful followers something else, and that's much different from what the radical Paul says, that there's no distinction between believers at all. We can read more about Paul in Luke's writing in Acts, which tells the story of Paul. The book of Hebrews is sometimes attributed to Paul, at least in the King James Version of the Bible. It's labeled as the letter of Paul to the Hebrews. However, modern scholarship thinks it's probably a far stretch, but they had to name some author in order to get it into the scriptures, and so let's attribute it to Paul, and so that might be one of the reasons why it's in the New Testament. There are other writings about Paul that are not in the New Testament at all, such as the Acts of Paul and Thecla, which are dramatic depictions of Paul and his disciples as they go about sharing the faith and starting churches. And those of us who look at just one or two aspects of Paul are convinced that his statement in Romans about being saved through faith alone and not through works is the foundation of all Protestant theology, so he's very important in that regard. And those who think that women should have a subordinate position in the church or in life like some of the passages that are attributed to Paul, what some in the Southern Baptist Convention call the gut check passages, in which females are told to keep quiet and work out their salvation through having children, which is very different from what we see Paul talking about in his authentic writings. I'll say more about this when we get to Ephesians next week. But the writings today are from what's called the first Paul, authentic Paul, 1 Thessalonians. Again, the characteristics of the radical Paul, he saw himself called by God directly, he wasn't the product of human intervention. He claims his experience of Jesus is just like those of the first apostles, even though his was somewhat later, and he did not see Jesus during Jesus' earthly ministry. But Paul is radical in that he takes the gospel to the Gentiles. He's not content to keep God's kingdom as only a teaching for Jewish believers, but quickly proclaims that non-Jews, non-circumcised, those not keeping all the ritual law, have access to the gospel just as well as observant Jews do. And of course, what I fall back on in talking about what separates the first Paul from later interpreters is his radical equality of all believers, which is something that we need to remember in the modern day, that males and females, Jews and Gentiles, those that are in or out, we're all equal in God's sight. So any retreat from this radical equality, I have to question whether that's really Paul teaching or not. Paul's preaching of the gospel to the Thessalonican congregation is the first example of the gospel going to Europe. Macedonia is, of course, northern Greece. Up till this point, the gospel was over in the Holy Land and up in Asia Minor and Turkey and those places. But one thing that I should mention, I could have mentioned before, but when you look at 1 Thessalonians, you can't find early examples, early manuscripts of just 1 Thessalonians. There's no way to trace Paul's individual writings because the earliest examples of Paul's writing are in compilations that contain most, if not all, of the writings attributed to Paul. So all of them are lumped together. You can look at the P46, it's called, or number 46 manuscript, which is a very early manuscript, but it includes all the letters of Paul. So doubtless some of these letters have scribal additions or corrections, and scholars are able to trace the differences in the strains of Paul in these letters, and these different interpretations or different aspects of Paul are what give rise to the 9 faces of Paul that are mentioned earlier. Of course, conservative writers object to this. They say, oh, who needs critical scholarship? Take your speculation about the scriptures. God said it, I believe it, and that settles it. So, those who have inerrancy of scripture or other fundamentalist ideas, of course, they don't see differences of Paul. They say that if we get different teachings in Paul, well, maybe he changed his mind, is what they say. But it's an open question. My position is closer to those who say that there is an original, authentic Paul, and then there are later interpretations of Paul. And to me, I see how it's possible to trace the authentic Paul and separate it from others who come afterwards and teach a gospel that focuses on their pet teachings and not exactly what was original to Paul. But that's why we have Sunday school classes, and that's why it's good to link up with one so you can hear these different perspectives and share your own opinion. The main point in 1 Thessalonians is that we're to live holy lives until Jesus returns. Now, I thought about this today, and there are no instructions in 1 Thessalonians that say, okay, sell all your possessions, lump your money together as believers, sit with everybody and just pray, or proclaim on the mountaintop that there's going to be great destruction. You don't see anything like that as a teaching from Paul about being ready for the second coming. So there was great misunderstanding about this teaching. Some thought that, well, if the second coming is imminent, we might as well just sit around and enjoy ourselves and retreat from the world. But there are not instructions for that in these writings. With regard to the second coming, the exact day and hour is unknown. We don't know exactly when the second coming is going to be, though it's a certainty. Every generation of believers has thought that this could be the generation in which it happens, including the current generation. That's why books about the second coming and the apocalypse are bestsellers even today. But as I say, this letter of 1 Thessalonians may be the first New Testament writing. As a new Christian, I thought maybe the Gospels were the first writing, because they talk about Jesus, which was, of course, in the calendar. Jesus was on earth much before Paul's teaching and the early churches were established. So it was a surprise to me to learn that the letters of Paul were actually the first written New Testament documents. Paul's stay at Thessalonica is narrated in Acts 17. There's a few verses that give over to discussing Paul's stay there. So keep in mind the map here of the Middle East. Down in Jerusalem, the Holy Land, that's where it all got started. And you can see those arrows coming up the coast of Syria into Asia. That's where the gospel was first proclaimed. But now you can see the yellow star there. This is up in Europe now. So the gospel has gone from the environs of the Middle East up to Asia and Turkey. Now it's over in Greece, which is in Asia, to Philippi and Thessalonica. Paul goes to Athens and other places as well. They're in Europe. Our lesson today are a few verses. Our text continues the discussion of Jesus' second coming, what some people call the parousia, which is a Greek word that means reoccurring or coming again. And Jesus' first coming is called Advent or Incarnation. There are lots of teachings associated with the first coming, and it seems that there are also a growing number of teachings associated with the second coming. I'll say this with tongue in cheek as I read some of the more liberal scholars who say those fundamentalists and others who focus only on the second coming, they say, well, what's the matter? Is there not enough teaching in the first coming that you need to discount that and move on to the second coming? And that's a kind way to say those who don't appreciate the clear message of servant ministry that Jesus taught while on earth, those who don't appreciate that tend to gloss over the first coming and want to focus more on the second coming. Because instead of being servants of all, maybe we're going to be commissioned with the conquering hero and we're going to be able to lord over those who are unrepentant. But I believe it's a mistake to worry too much about the second coming. That's why I have plenty of instructions for the first coming. I don't find fault with those who want to think about it, but to build a whole lifestyle and theology on aspects of the second coming which are not clearly understood or clearly delineated seems to be a fool's errand or a waste of time. That's the way I look at it. Others see it differently, may see it differently. But I thank Paul for his writings and having us focus on what we need to say and do in preparation for the second coming. I want to show you a bust of Aristotle. Aristotle was a great thinker in the ancient world. You may not know he was the tutor of Alexander the Great. So the conqueror of the world during the great Greek Empire, starting there in Greece, was Aristotle. And his teachings were dominant in his day, and they are still dominant. Many people think that he was the first scientific or critical thinker. And he had a teaching of science that he called the four causes, which some see as the beginning of scientific inquiry. In other words, you can look at something and say, what causes this to happen? You can look at what is the cause of anything physical, or what is the cause of anything in the world. And he said, well, there are four causes. There's a formal cause or first cause. There's a final cause for why something is built or what the purpose of it is, which we call the final cause. There is the material that goes into whatever the creation is, the material cause. And there's the agent that brought it into being, who fashioned it, who is the carpenter, the builder, or the creator of something. That's called the efficient cause of something. And this idea of the four causes is a very important doctrine in medieval theology and those who write about religious topics and even worldly topics. I mention this because Aristotle's four causes is one way to look at the second coming without getting too caught up in the details. We know that God is the first cause of everything in existence. So God would be in the beginning. God created existence. And we know God is the final cause. The end of creation is going to serve whatever purpose God has in mind. So that is about as specific teaching about the second coming as I'm comfortable to go into, that we know everything started with God and that everything is going to be finished off in accordance with God's purposes. So that's a certainty. These are certainties. These other aspects of God, the physics of things, who created it, and the material from which things are created, these are not as permanent. These are ephemeral. They come and go. But if we focus on God as the beginning of all things and the end of all things, I don't think we're going to misinterpret the second coming too much. God is the beginning and the end. So let's see what Paul says here. His instructions in 1 Thessalonians 5, 1 through 5 says, now concerning the times and seasons, two different words, times and seasons, brothers and sisters, you do not need to have anything written to you, for you yourselves know very well that the day of the Lord will come like a thief in the night. When they say, there is peace and security, then suddenly destruction will come upon them, as labor pains come upon a pregnant woman, and there will be no escape. But you, brothers and sisters, are not in darkness, for that day to surprise you like a thief. For you are children of light and children of the day. We are not of the night or of darkness. So, this general statement regarding the creation and the apocalypse, we see first stated in its most general terms in Aristotle's four causes, but here we see God is first cause, God is the source of all things, and God is final cause. All creation is going to be consumed by God in the day of the Lord, as Paul mentioned here. So any Jewish believer or follower would be aware of this concept of day of the Lord. So in Christian theology, when the return of Jesus to the world was taught, it was natural to lump that into the day of the Lord theology. We know God is first cause, God is final cause. We know God is efficient cause, God is the agent, the artisan, the creator of all things. And God is also the material cause. God is substance of all. There are some teachings, pantheists would say, that all creation is somehow subsumed under God. So you can't go too far wrong focusing on God as first and last. And we know for a fact that there was a first cause and a creation of all things. And we know as a fact that all things will be concluded by God at God's appointed hour. So the Jewish interpretation of final cause as day of the Lord is analogous to, or is in keeping with, the second coming of Jesus, the parousia of Jesus. Paul says that there are two aspects to time. There is chronological time, quantity, that's what in the text what it says times, and there's also seasonal time, or there are different quality of the seasons. And that's one way of talking about eternal time. So when we talk about God of eternity, we may be talking about just chronological time, hours that just keep on accumulating, but it may be that eternal time is a quality of time that's far different than just the accumulation of seconds, minutes, hours, days, and weeks. And that seems to be what Paul is stressing here in his distinction between times and seasons. This is a good teaching to keep in mind. Time in this context has to do with chronology. How many hours? What's the quantity? Get 8 hours of sleep, 24 hours in a day, 365 days in a year. We all have various quantities of time, but there are also kinds of time. There are also seasons. This is a great picture that depicts the clock on top of the four seasons: spring, summer, fall, and winter. And I'm thinking that quality of time has more to do with eternity than quantity of time. Interesting aspects. God provides. Thessalonians 5, 6 through 11 says, "So then, let us not fall asleep as others do, but let us keep awake and sober. For those who sleep, sleep at night, and those who are drunk, get drunk at night. But since we belong to the day, let us be sober, and put on the breastplate of faith and love, and for a helmet the hope of salvation. For God has destined us not for wrath, but for obtaining salvation through our Lord Jesus Christ, who died for us, so that whether we are awake or asleep, we may live with him. Therefore, encourage one another and build up each other, as indeed you are doing." Okay, this is the teaching about the second coming. We are children of light, not darkness. We are living in the light. Paul admonishes us to keep awake and sober, not asleep and drunk. These are the most definitive teachings with regard to preparation for the second coming. It's not that we sell all our possessions and band together and sing and pray and do nothing else, but we keep awake and sober. The word pictures in the text, there are some metaphors here. Like he talks about whether we're asleep or awake, we're going to experience Jesus. He's not talking about physical sleep, but death. If we've experienced the sleep of death, then we will experience the second coming just as well as those who have not died at that time. We talk about our faith and love as a breastplate that protects us and keeps us whole from the world. We talk about a helmet, which is also an item of defense. These are not offensive weapons that we go smashing others in the world, but these are defensive weapons which help us to persevere in the world through faith, hope, love, and salvation and hope. We'll see more about this in Ephesians when Paul talks about the full armor of God, which includes these concepts, but also other aspects of faith. But he further admonishes us to encourage one another and build one another up. That's how we prepare for the second coming. Not finding fault, being grumpy, disagreeable, trying to get what we want to the exclusion of everyone else, and trying to be good ourselves by putting others down. That's the furthest thing from Paul's instruction about the Christian life as we await the second coming, but it's one of encouraging one another and building each other up. So we walk in light, not in the darkness. We're to stay awake and watchful, not fast asleep. We're to stay sober amidst those who are drunk on a drunken planet. Be sober in the midst of drunkenness. Be positive. Doing the right thing. And this is summarized in this statement, which skips a couple of verses, but is a good summary statement for this teaching of building one another up. And we urge you, brothers and sisters, to admonish the idlers, encourage the faint-hearted, help the weak, but be patient with all of them. See that none of you repays evil for evil, but always seek to do good to one another and to all. Rejoice always, pray without ceasing. These are tall orders. Paul gets carried away with commands here. You know, when he gets to writing, he likes to string things together, whether it's genitive statements or commands, and we have a series of them here. Imperative statements telling us how exactly to build one another up. He says we are to admonish idlers, encourage the faint-hearted. Admonish has something to do with directing, saying what to do. Encourage has more to do with empathy and being kind-hearted, helping those who cannot help themselves, actually doing something, not just sitting back and watching, but those who are not able to do for themselves, we can help them and do for them. And whether we are dealing with idlers, the faint-hearted, or the weak, we're to be patient with all of them, never repaying evil for evil. Whenever we do evil, all that does is put more evil into the world. We're in the business of taking evil out of the world. So we never repay evil, but just do good one to another. In other words, to other fellow brothers and sister believers, but also to all those who are not believers. So we do that, do good to one another, rejoice always, and pray without ceasing. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Here are 8 commandments. 8 in these few verses on how to build one another up, how to prepare for the second coming. Notice these are not passive things. These are not self-directed things to do. These are not selfish things to do, but these build at helping ourselves and others. to be happy and to pray without ceasing. Wow. Rejoice always, give thanks in all circumstances. So, these admonitions, these 8 commands, these are applicable for all times, in other words, the chronological times, and for all the seasons, during the good and the bad. As long as we are drawing breath and alive on this earth, we are to do these things as we await the eventual triumphant day of the Lord, which will come. It's sure to come. We just don't know exactly when. I could spend the whole hour just talking about these words, but I'm not going to do that. But in verse 1, I've talked about the times and seasons, and hope that you will learn and find this a useful distinction between quantity of time, just hours, and sometimes when we're happy or sad, there's a quality of time that goes along with the quantity. We're to remain awake and sober. This word for awake is, if you know anybody named Gregory or Greg, that is the Greek word for being awake and sober. Thought I'd mention that in case we have any Gregs or Gregorys who are in the audience. And sober means not to be intoxicated. We are to build each other up by cooperation, not saying our way or the highway. Those who are idlers, what is an idler? And it's a military term that means they're AWOL, they're not at their post. So, I have served as deacon on several times, and I have seen deacons nominated and appointed who never show up again, who are idlers. So it's not a first century phenomenon that we have those of the faith who become idlers and never show up again. We are to stay in contact with them and admonish them, point out what they could be doing. We're to cheer up. This word faint-hearted is those who have a little soul. Do you have a little soul, or is your heart large and big enough to make room for others? But there are some of the faith whose faith are not as robust or strong as others. We need to cheer them up and help them be faithful, because there are some who are feeble and sick, who are not able to do for themselves. We are to help them. This word for patience means long suffering, those who are able to tolerate evil without succumbing to the urge to strike back. Long suffering, patient. Rejoice always, to be happy. That root word for rejoice means the same thing as happiness or as receiving a gift. Grace is also a sister word there. So if we are not rejoicing as Christians, we're perverted in some way. Pray, give thanks unceasingly. I don't know if it's possible to always pray without ceasing, but it's never wrong to give thanks to God. I look at these 8 commands. These are active things to do. These are more like Jesus' incarnation, the commands to build up the kingdom of God on earth, rather than sit back and wait and speculate on this second coming. Though we know for certain it's going to happen, because God created all, God is going to redeem, and the day of the Lord will happen to accomplish God's objectives in creation. We just don't know when it's going to happen. But until then, we can busy ourselves with these 8 commands. What a text. So what are our issues? The purpose of the church is rescue, not condemnation. We need to be helping, encouraging, doing for those that are having a hard time of it. This day of the Lord, in Old Testament phraseology, is analogous to the second coming of the Lord. It's certain in God's appropriate season, but its chronological timing is unknown. So I think it's a waste of time to speculate on when this might happen. It's better to live out Jesus' teachings from the incarnation, summarized by these 8 commands of Paul in our text today, in my opinion. The Christian faith is a cause for rejoicing and thankfulness. What a text. This is New Testament theology brought up to 2023. And there's no mystery in it. We can busy ourselves with these commands of the Lord and never miss a beat. And lose ourselves in the making and preparation for the second coming, whenever that is. So thank you for joining me today. Again, please don't take me too seriously. I have my way of looking at things. I encourage you to have your own points of view, but I encourage you to join a class so that you can discuss these things. Again, I'm a lay person. My views are not endorsed by this church, the pastor, the denomination, or anyone. If we were to meet and discuss these things, I would welcome some discussion with you, and I could provide much more background for why I believe the way these things are, and I'm always open to hear other views as well. But let's remember our prayer concerns as we are praying without ceasing. It's always appropriate to lift up and remember the concerns and those who are struggling with physical illness, disease, who are struggling emotionally, whose seasons are not as positive as we would hope they would be. And I'll see you next week for the concluding lesson in this unit. As always, my heart goes out to Daryl for all the work that he does to set up these sessions and our worship time together. These would not happen without Daryl, and I'm so grateful for his presence in my life. Thank you, Daryl. Till next week, I will say goodbye.